This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today, Aaron Brown, an American finance practitioner, author, expert, risk management, gambling-related issues. Most famously known as the former chief risk manager at AQR Capital Management, one of the biggest funds in the world, I believe north of $100 billion. You have to think that if Cliff Asness signed off on hiring Aaron Brown, there must be something interesting about this guy, even if we've not read his books or know anything about him. And oh, by the way, if you want to check out something kind of cool, the MIT Educational Forum with Aaron Brown, where he discusses the history of poker. There you go. Send me your thank you in email for that one alone. To listen to Aaron describe something like a simple card game and the history of America and how it all ties together. Really cool stuff. Today, I take Aaron on my podcast around the risk landscape, picking and prodding his mind as much as I can to get him to give me as much as he will. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Aaron Brown. So, so many people, Aaron, they want to be the quant, but it's kind of an odd thing where people, they want to be this great sounding term, but not many people are comfortable with an occupation where you really might not know more than 51%, are they?
Well, let me take a slightly discursive answer to that. The word was originally an insult. And that was from like mid to late 90s. And then it got kind of adopted defiantly, kind of like gay people decided they were queer. And then suddenly it became cool and popular. But yes, it is not a way most people want to live. And it's not a question of math ability. You can't have zero math ability to be a quant, but lots of people have all the math ability. They just don't have the personality. My personal definition of quant is someone who makes calculations and bets on them. And there are a lot more people who want to make calculations than who want to bet on them.
That probably gets at my next direction I really want to go is, why have so many people wanted you? I mean, I think you might have just answered it there as you can do the calculations and make the bets. But why have so many people wanted you over your career? What is it about your personality that drives them to come to you?
Yeah, it's not my personality. I'm pretty sure about that. Well, I'll tell you something Paul Wilmot said about me that I think he might have meant as an insult. I'm not sure, but that I've always treasured. He said, Aaron Brown can solve any problem for which a solution is known to exist. And I never quite figured out why he said that or what specifically he meant. But that is my talent, that I don't tackle problems where I'm not sure a solution exists, where, people are going to argue about what the solution should be. I like things where when you find a solution, it is, and there has to be a solution. That's why I like applied math rather than pure math. And that turns out to be valuable in the financial world.
You just said something about people not liking your personality. Maybe you didn't phrase it that way, or you said it's not your personality. But, I've had a chance to kind of sit with you on some of your presentations online, and there's a certain passion there. There's a certain gleam in your eye where you just, you can feel the love for this content. So are you sure people aren't really attracted to something there beyond just the skill set?
Well, probably. Actually, I guess I put it two ways. I have always been in groups with people like, Nassim Taleb and Paul Wilmot and, sort of Emmanuel Derman, people who kind of think like me. And I get along with them well and have a lot of contacts and opportunities through that. But the people who have hired me, the people I've worked for, typically are not that kind of person, typically would prefer somebody who did what I did with a different way of going about it, I think.
Define that so we can kind of, I didn't even know we were going to go in this path, but we kind of open it up. You talk about, I've had Emmanuel on this podcast, and obviously we all know of Nassim Taleb. You talk about having this fondness for the interaction with those men, and I can appreciate that immediately, which tells me a lot about you. But the people that hire you, it seems like that conversation you'd be having with Emmanuel and Nassim would be the reason they would want to hire you. But what do they want to do different once they hire you?
Well, I think actually we kind of set it up pretty well. Everybody loves Emmanuel. I won't say everybody hates Nassim, but
he has sharp elbows.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. Call me halfway in between. I've never managed to be as gracious or as popular as Emmanuel, but I've managed to avoid making as many enemies as Nassim.
But what do you think, though, really, when you say that when people hire you, they want something different? Is it? Do you feel like you're like put into a box at that point in time, and you just have to deliver some kind of skill set? Of course, that you have. Is it they don't want the philosophical? What is it that they're trying to change or don't like?
The stuff I do is inherently disruptive. One of the weird things about our world, people 1,000 years from now look back on our society. I think the weirdest thing they're going to think, the thing they're going to find hardest to understand, is why we allocate power according to claimed ability to deal with risk, either to anticipate what's going to happen, to predict what's going to happen, or to deal with it as it arises. And we never actually test it, So we have all these leaders who tell you exactly what's going to happen and exactly what we should do. And we don't really keep track to see if they're right. And of course, they're not. So when you come in and you start doing these quantitative things and say, okay, this thing you thought was your core competency that was making a lot of money is really no better than random, or that we've been making an awful lot of bets that have low probability but high impact negative outcomes that you've been unaware of. That's not easy to hear, and that disrupts things. Powerful people lose their base of power. Things have to change. Sometimes money has to be given up. Opportunities have to be given up. There are people like Emmanuel who manage to work at a place like Goldman Sachs and communicate that and get people to change without causing offense. And then there are people like Nassim Taleb who live to cause offense. I'm kind of more neutral about it. Here's the facts. If it's disruptive, it's disruptive. It's not my problem. Here's what the facts. Here's what we have to do. And you guys figure out, who's going to get the credit and the blame and so on. I want to go back to my office and think about the next problem.
I've seen you say it. So Wall Street is really, I don't think people really think about this clearly, but Wall Street is about sales. It's about selling something. So I guess if you walk into a room of people that ultimately, regardless of title, net worth, etc., if you walk into a room full of people that make their money by sales and you are telling the truth, I guess a couple slings and arrows will occasionally come your way, huh?
Yeah, and and there are ways to phrase it in a sales-friendly way, but I've never troubled to do it. I don't think it's so much I'm bad. I honestly don't care, and I probably could do a better job if I tried, but it's not a lack of skill so much as a personality. Like, I don't want to argue about it. I don't want you to tell me, how this is going to mess up our sales. I'm telling you, this product should not be sold. And, you guys can do with that whatever you will.
You care about the direction you're going down, the research, the truth that you figured out. You just don't care about whatever constraints have to go along with the sales operation.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Finance has always been sales. That's what's rewarded. That's what it's about. The fact that those sales have to be constrained by a little reality. I might compare myself a little bit to an equity analyst. Equity analysts write reports, and they also try to tell the truth, but they are very, very attuned to the sales implications of what they say, both to the issuer side, the security issuer side, and to the investor side. And they get very good at that, and therefore they work well with salespeople. I could never be an equity analyst. I was offered a job once as an equity analyst, and I figured out immediately that I could not do it.
Okay, let me take you back in time. So we're talking about kind of current day and looking back in history, looking back throughout your career, talking about working with various Wall Street firms. I want to know, place me a date, a time, an age for you where you first had that wrap your arms around the idea and thinking in terms of odds, appreciating chance. Oh, look, there's uncertainty. Risk. Give me an age the event, something, the person, the trigger, the book, the mentor? When did that start for you?
I may have been born with that. And if I wasn't, it probably came about from reading Beat the Dealer back when I was 8 or 9 years old by Ed Thorpe. I just always thought that way. There were two great revelations, two sort of elaborations of that belief. The first was at age 14 when I realized I could walk into a commercial poker game. I could sit down, I could win. I knew I could win. That was never an issue. And people would let me walk out with the money.
How did that make you feel, though? You could walk out with the money. You just kind of went by that fast. 14 years old, you're beating grown men, and you could walk out with the money. How did that feel?
That was very important to me for various reasons. So I'm 61 years old. So we're talking about 1970 and Seattle, the recession of the 70s, the bad malaise of the 70s kind of hit Seattle a couple of years earlier than the rest of the country. And things felt very insecure. The idea of getting a job seemed, very insecure. And it seemed like money was really important and that you couldn't count on, any of the traditional things. There's inflation seemed out of control, hyperinflation, taxes seemed, very high and very unpredictable and so on. And, it just seemed like a very complicated world that was very scary. And poker was pretty simple. You walked in, you bet your money, you got your money, you walked out. That's why I was attracted to it. I was also attracted to sports betting, to horse racing, and so on. But those were more difficult for me to access at that age. Poker, there was no age requirement because technically all of it was illegal, but nobody really cared. They couldn't enforce age restrictions like they could at the racetrack. And so it was very important to me. And I realized when I walked out there, I said, okay, I don't know what's going to happen in life, but I know I can always, get enough money to eat today, to get a place to stay for the night, whatever, because there's always poker anywhere in the world. All you have to do is find a game. And if you're a good player, even if you have no money, somebody will lend you a stake. You got guaranteed income for life. And that bit of security has always been very important to me. Far more important than things like having an income, having wealth, assets. Those things can all kind of disappear. But the ability to make your own money in a self-organized way without external rules, without counting on some government or company or a set of rules other than the sort of poker player network. So that's when I decided, okay, I can make a living exploiting chance, exploiting bets.
We won't go there today, but I want to implore the audience to check out your MIT presentation, easily found on YouTube, where you kind of explore the history of poker. It's an hour-long plus presentation, really worth checking out. It's one of those aha moments where you just kind of go, oh, wow, I did not know that,
Thank you. But then the second one is, okay, so now we're going, and I go off to college and pay my way through with poker and also doing some sports betting, doing some blackjack stuff and whatever. Let's say, late 70s. So now I'm, my early 20s. It hits me that, it's a lot easier. There's a lot more money to be made, and the gambling is a lot easier on Wall Street than in Las Vegas. That was a daring thought at the time. There weren't mathematicians on Wall Street. If you want to get a Wall Street job and you happen to take some math courses, you left them off your resume. As we said earlier, Wall Street was all about sales, and nobody wanted any math in any of it. But I started looking at the things. I read Beat the Market by Ed Thorpe. I read a lot of other stuff. And I thought, okay, the edges are a lot bigger on Wall Street. And the amount you can bet and get paid are much larger. Gambling for a living, if you do it on your own, if you don't join with a group, if you don't sort of start a business of some sort, if you're just doing it on your own, it's hard to make more than, I would say, in modern dollars, let's say $500,000, $600,000 a year. Back in those days, that would have been more like $150,000 a year. And, that's great. You can live on that. You can live pretty well if you're a single young guy and all you want to do is, have beer and a big TV set and go out to the casino. Wall Street was orders of magnitude more opportunity, more profit. So then we go, I would say it would be 1982 when I realized that this stuff really works. It's not just theory. You always kind of feel in the back of your mind that, well, they've got some trick. They can't be as easy as it looks. They have to know something I don't. when quants first came to Wall Street, so this is late 70s, early 80s, I was kind of, 3 or 4 years after the first people who did this. We were regarded just as, one more group to help the sales. If you come to Wall Street and you say, I want to make money with astrology, I want to make money, by asking my dog what stocks to buy and see which ones he barks, they love you because as far as they're concerned, your job is to go out and raise money from investors and pay fees on your trades, and they don't care at all whether your trades work or don't work. Makes no difference. Your job is to gather assets and generate commissions. And it took them until really the mid to late 80s, and some of them still haven't figured it out today, that the quants were different because the quants actually made money. And when you actually make money, that whole sales model of taking commissions from both sides and nobody ever actually making any money, just going back and forth, doesn't work. It's very similar to what casinos, figured out. Casinos really didn't like the game of poker because, in other casino games, any money the player loses, the casino wins. It's very upsetting to casinos to know that somebody in the building is making money and it's not coming from them, or somebody else is losing money and they're not getting it. Wall Street was just as unprepared for it as casinos weren't prepared for poker, that there were people out there making money, consistently winning strategies. So that's when the quant era really began. That's when people started taking it seriously. That's when people started making up the name quant as an insult. You didn't need the insult before because you didn't care enough about them. It's only when people started realizing how important we were that they had to give us a pejorative name.
I want to stay at something for a moment and let you elaborate a little bit more on it because you've mentioned it several times, starting at 8 or 9 years of age. Beat the dealer, Ed Thorpe. I mean, here you are, a guy who was chief risk manager at AQR, a $100 billion plus fund. And here you are giving insights to my audience, to everyone that's going to listen. And you're essentially saying, you know what? It was that 21 book from a guy named Ed Thorpe back 50s, 60s. And that was my driver. That was my influence. And I would love you to expand on that and kind of really give your big picture view. But also, at first, before you even go there, the 8 or 9-year-old Aaron, what was the takeaway at 8 or 9? Because I have a feeling you might remember what it was. I mean, there must have been some big aha moment within that text. Was it just learning the rules of the game properly? Was there something that he said that this drove you from that moment in time?
There used to be something called newspapers that, many younger people don't remember, but that's how we used to get our news before the internet. And the newspaper would come every day. And this is actually true of a lot of kids of my age. I read it backwards. I read it from the back because in the back were all the numbers. And there were stock quotations, there were baseball box scores, there were all kinds of numbers. And those made sense to me. As I got further and further up into the paper where it started getting more words and news and this and that, it just seemed irrelevant and impossible to understand. And one of the reasons, by the way, I think I was right, is if I gave you a newspaper from 50 years ago, the headlines would make no sense. You have zero interest in any of the things people were, the bond issue for the bridge, the attack here, the disaster there. None of that would seem to matter at all. But people still track those baseball statistics and still track those stock market prices. So I was right that was the really important stuff. And I'm noticing patterns in it. I'm noticing I can, do some math on the things and I can predict some things. And it didn't take me long to start thinking, well, gee, you could, make some money. But I didn't really believe you could do it. I thought, okay, I'm noticing patterns, but, they can't possibly be right. It can't be that easy to predict horse races or to predict stock price movements and so on. Then I'd go to the library and I'd look for books. Our library didn't have, public library didn't have a great selection of gambling books, but, every so often there'd be, and would stick in. And most of them were written by people who did not seem very smart. Most of them were, some of the ideas were just wrong. Other ideas probably made some sense from kind of experience, but weren't based on any logic or reasoning. And then I come across this book by a math professor, and he explains exactly why it works. And he explained that he actually went there and did it and made it work. And the whole animating motivation of the book, how he talked about, I got interested in this problem and I worked on the problem and I solved the problem. And then I went out and I bet and I won. That resonated very strongly with me. That is what I wanted to do with life. I wanted to find problems, solve them, not just make some money. I mean, making money is one way to prove your solution works, but the key is you're beating somebody. You're doing what you're not supposed to do. Everybody tells you can't beat the house, you can't fight City Hall, you can't do anything, you can't beat the market. And here's a guy who says, yeah, you can, and he used some math. And I understood the math, and I could do the math myself. I couldn't actually reproduce his computations at the time because I didn't have as big a computer as he did, but I could work out approximations that were enough to convince me that the thing actually worked. Even mathematicians at the time, this is something that really hit me. There were mathematicians at the time who dismissed the work, not because they had gone through the math and decided it was wrong, but they had this idea, you can't beat the house. No system of betting can ever win. And they had, for so many centuries, mathematicians have told people, no, a martingale strategy doesn't work at roulette. No, betting on the number that hasn't come up, in the last 20 spins doesn't work. They've gotten so ingrained that they forgot the mathematical basis for the reason the casino wins and started taking it as just a religious article. And the fact that, even mathematicians would do that, much less everybody else, told me I was on to a rare and secret truth.
It sounds like also just as a really big kind of aha moment that when you saw, even though it was via your library through a book, the moment you saw that someone else could do it, they proved it. You didn't know him at all. Obviously, you had no connection to him. Maybe you've met him by now, you're later on in life, but you had no connection to a distant, immediate lightning bolt inspiration. Okay, if he can do it, I can do it.
Yep. And by the way, yes, I have met him since, and he's a friend. Doesn't live too far from here, actually. But yes, I didn't know him. But it was very important that he was a math professor. It was very important he was from MIT. If just, some random guy had done this, if I had come across, one of the books by some of the later blackjack experts, Arnold Snyder or someone who didn't have the academic credential, then I would not have been so convinced. But my father was a professor. I was used to the idea that, a PhD from MIT means something. And if he says it and I can kind of follow his reasoning and verify it, I believe it. If somebody had written a book, how I made $1 million playing blackjack, and here's my system, it would not have meant the same thing to me.
I want to take a slight divergence from where we are right now to go to something, a side topic to this world. I see many, many traders, and I first noticed this over 15 years ago. I kept seeing so many traders, so many people on Wall Street had this love affair for Ayn Rand. And I've noticed on Quora.com, you are the champion in terms of answers, and really so much of it seems to be even beyond Wall Street. And so many people are really coming to you for views on liberty. They really want, the Aaron Brown view on liberty. Why don't you also give me a starting place for that too? When you first had your kind of I don't want to say come to Jesus, but your first moment where you wrapped your arms around the idea of Smith and Hume and Hayek and Mises and Rand, and you said to yourself, okay, this is really resonating with me.
I didn't read Ayn Rand until much later in life. I'm not particularly, whatever I say, I'm not particularly impressed by most of it. There's a lot of weird stuff in there. Came to that stuff much later. My kind of native self-invented libertarianism comes from just an idea that, institutions are big and stupid. and I just always wanted to beat casinos. I wanted to beat the government. I wanted to beat the market. I wanted that kind of individualism, and that the enemy of all of that was always stupid people who organized together to keep you down, to suppress innovation, to make sure that they were comfortable regardless of what happened to anybody else. It was by no means a philosophical or political libertarianism. It was just a personal desire to do what I wanted and to do it on my own. Older, I was probably in college when I came across reading some of these people, and some of it resonated with me, some of it didn't. Eventually, I guess I consider myself sort of a Hayek, would be the closest thinker. A lot of libertarians, sort of the the Ayn Randian libertarians can be pretty weird. Murray Rothbard type hard property rights libertarians, they say a lot of stuff I don't agree with. There's a certain kind of libertarian who believes you should have absolutely no government, except you should have this extraordinarily powerful, vicious, violent thing to protect property rights. And that just made zero sense to me. If I don't regard property rights as any more important than any other. In fact, they're probably less important than most other rights. Within the libertarians of like the 70s and 80s, 90s, I was kind of a touchy-feely, a pacifist type. I was a moral libertarian. I start everything from it's never right to initiate violence against an innocent. And that when you reason from that, you just rule out almost all the things governments do. But I never really started out with rights of man or objectivism or anything like that. I think libertarians have kind of moved toward me. I think I'm now more mainstream than I would have been in those days. So the main actual thing I ever did, I was never an organizer. I never did anything. I would refuse to give my Social Security number. And I did that for many years. It got harder and harder. Eventually I gave it up, probably sometime around the mid-'80s or so. It just got too hard to do it. But, you learn a lot about libertarianism if you actually try and do that. Just you tell people, no, I don't have to give you my Social Security number. The law says I don't have to give it to you. I can carry a piece of the law around with me to show it to you. Life got very, very difficult. I sort of feel bad that I gave that up. I wish I was still doing that. Of course, in 1976, they changed the law, and now you are basically required to give your Social Security number. That was the kind of thing that appealed to me.
Do you ever think, like in modern times right now, 2018, do you sometimes think the fight for liberty, and you mentioned various incarnations and I mentioned some names, you mentioned some names. Do you ever think that fight is lost for America?
No, I absolutely don't. The fight was in the 70s and 80s, it was basically people who had escaped communism. And they had some very specific ideas that didn't really apply. And they did lose. And I think, they're gone. They're historical relics. They're not going to be and a lot of libertarian organizations still, worship them and still, have their writings, but they're just not really relevant. I think that by changes in technology, people are reclaiming a lot of liberty. I don't think there's going to be a huge change of governments, giving people liberty in areas where they had previously not had it. There'll be a little of that, things like gay marriage, abortion rights, legalization of marijuana, and so on. That's not going to go all that far. But people are going to invent ways to be free. I don't think there is a political will to stop that. And even if they had the will, their ability is questionable. It's very hard for government to deal with innovation. So I think a generation will grow up that is used to the fact that you can do what you want without too much oversight and regulation. I don't think we're going to go to a pure libertarian society, but I do think my children will be much freer than I was.
I have so many economists come on this show and we share insights about these topics. So I was just really curious your opinion. I appreciate that. I want to shift into something that really starts to get into when people are listening, they say, hey, I really want to know something about this from Aaron. If I want to take you back in time, gosh, I can't believe it's a decade now, right? To 07, 08, right? Can you really, it just seems time has flown from that time period. When you look back on that time period, a decade ago, and I'm sure you've reassessed every month, every year since then and kind of thought about that time period. What is the big takeaway now, a decade later, for you? I mean, like if you're just kind of talking to yourself and you're sharing views on risk management, what is your takeaway for that time period?
I think the most important thing about it from my point of view is it was actually the most statistically predictable, by the book financial crisis we've ever had. It's the antithesis of 1987. 1987 was the weirdest, the one that violated all the rules we thought we knew. most financial crises, they follow certain patterns. And to somebody who's, 20,000 feet away, somebody who's looking at they all look the same. Well, people got greedy and over leveraged, and then it fell apart, and then there was a crisis. But when you actually live through these things and you're responsible for lots of money and you're having to make decisions of what to do, you get a very different view. There's a very different feel for different kinds of crises. This one was very predictable. I mean, I don't mean I could predict it. Hold on. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it was very much of a random walk crisis. If you look, you saw volatility going up, and then you saw up and down movements that you would expect given that volatility, and you saw a big down move, and then you saw a big up move. The only thing about it that was kind of unpredictable, out of left field, that surprised a lot of people, including me, and caused problems, was the government reaction. The government did not react the way I would have expected on it, and that messed things up a lot. The other thing I say about it is people have a tendency, it's sold Nassim Taleb's narrative fallacy. They tend to tell a story about something, and they tend to tell a story in the order things happened. And, the first thing the first shoe that dropped in this crisis was subprime. And so people call it the subprime crisis, and they kind of trace it. Well, there were subprimes, and that led to CDOs, and CDOs led to CDO squared, and blah, blah, blah. But when you look back and you actually see, okay, what was really going on? What was the problem? It certainly wasn't subprime. It just wasn't big enough. We had 5 previous subprime crises, and none of them even made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. They were just, contained within the subprime field. The fact that, these subprime pools, you expected a 5% loss rate, and you got about a 20% loss rate. Well, that's bad news. You're sorry you bought it, but you expected a 5% loss rate. You built in a 10% extra, interest kicker so that you would make money even with a 5% loss rate. So you expected to make 5% on these things, actually end up losing 10%. That's just not a disastrous occurrence. That's not something that makes institutions fail. That's not a gigantic surprise. Prime mortgages, there was a much bigger surprise. There were pools that should have had a 0.03% default rate that actually had a 1 or 2% default rate. That's a much, much bigger surprise. But even that wasn't enough. I think what you really have to think about, you have to say, let's look at 2007 to 2012. Let's look at the 5-year period. And the really, really big event in there, the sovereign debt crisis that kind of hit starting in 2010 with Greece and kind of spread. And people figured out that governments do not have enough money to pay the promises that they had made. And we kind of already knew that. But it was always actuarial. People were always saying, okay, in 25 years, the Social Security Trust Fund runs out, or you project things out. But when you project things out, people say, well, if investment returns are a little better, if healthcare costs don't rise so fast, if demographic projections come in a little better, the whole thing might go away. So let's worry about it tomorrow. When you actually have things start failing, when Greece actually fails, when Iceland actually fails, when Ireland actually fails, when Spain and Italy nearly fail, where Portugal nearly fail, that's a problem today. You have to deal with it today. And I think that change in mindset was the ultimate cause of what happened. The reason it showed up was, okay, so subprime has problems. So hedge funds have problems. The Bear Stearns hedge funds have problems. The Bear Stearns hedge fund problems spread to Bear Stearns. The Bear Stearns problems spread to the U.S. government. That's when people started doing the math and saying, wait a minute, the governments can't bail out the banks. If the banks lose money, that is not a statistically unpredictable amount of money. It's not something that somebody should have said was impossible. It was something that you would have expected if you were just looking at the value at risk these banks were publishing, if you were looking at the volatility of their stock prices and so on. In a bad event, but not a 10 standard deviation event, a 2.5 standard deviation bad event for the banks, the governments are helpless. And if the governments are helpless, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen to the value of our money. That was the reason, by the way, that Bitcoin was invented. At the time, nobody was paying any attention to that. But in fact, that was, here was a guy in 2008 who was seeing forward, or a group, we don't really know which, and seeing forward and saying the real ultimate issue here is government credit, is the value of money. That was not resolved until about 2012. That's when it went away. So the stock market, drops 50%, goes back up 100%, goes back up another 100%, and all that's where all the attention is focused. Banks go out of business, new government entities are formed, new laws are passed. That's all the attention. But the real issue was people believe that governments, and I'm talking primarily about here developed country governments, have surmounted the short-term problem of everything falling apart. We're not going to run out of money in the next 5 or 10 years. We're back to that actuarial problem 25 years down the road, where there's a lot of ways you can hope that things will get better. And to me, that was the nature of the crisis. Sovereign credit was the key, which we didn't know, nobody had any idea about until, 2010 or so.
Would you say that everything that took place, the various players, whether it was the feds or Mr. Buffett stepping up and getting some sweetheart deals, et cetera, TARP, lowering interest rates to zero, all these actions in hindsight from your perspective, would you say these were all correct and it all worked?
Well, it worked in the sense that everything survived, but I think things would have survived pretty much the same without those actions. I don't think those were so important. I think people are very conservative about finance. There's this real superstition that finance is all about confidence, and if somehow the public loses confidence, the whole system breaks down. Finance is not about confidence. Finance is about real solid economic relationships. There's really solid mathematics. You can trace this on. It's not about people panicking or doing stupid things. And therefore, all of the focus on we have to prevent panic, we have to prevent a bank run, we have to reassure the market, all that's nonsense. What really people did the math and found out that the government did have the money. It didn't really matter whether that money was in the Fed or whether the Fed used the money to buy assets from the bank. People figured out, the United States government has enough credit to keep the banks solvent and to keep the financial system running and to keep the dollar having value and to keep promises about pensions and health care and so forth. And that's when the stock market went back up. And then in Europe, it took a little longer because it was a lot closer call in Europe. And of course, in Greece, it couldn't be done. But people were willing. People decided, okay, Greece and Cyprus and a few other places are the outliers. The basic France, Germany can keep their promises, at least for long enough that somebody can maybe figure out a solution. Okay,
so that brings us up back to today. And I want to toss out a phrase that everyone hears and near and dear to you, the efficient market hypothesis, right? And so you have attended the University of Chicago and for your MBA, So we have on one side of the equation, in my mind, I can see Eugene Fama on one side of the equation. The other side, I can see people like Benoit Mandelbrot. I can see Jean-Philippe Bouchot out of Paris. I can see David Harding of Winton Capital. I can see this kind of dividing line between these camps, right? And you've kind of painted a picture of being a pretty pragmatic guy. Can you fill in the blanks for me? Is it really two poles? There's a chasm there, there's a separation, and it's two camps that just see the world very differently? Or is it been positioned as being more different than it really is?
People certainly feel very differently about it, and people will give you very different, like Eugene Fama still absolutely in his heart, you sit down with him, really believes everything is efficient. And even though he's published, the 5 Fama French factors, even though he's admitted there's, multiple risk factors and that things aren't completely efficient, he doesn't really accept it. And in fact, he will frequently forget it. You'll talk to him about things and you'll have to remind him, wait a minute, gee, you published a paper that said that wasn't the case. He really believes, I think, that someone in the future will come up with a more sophisticated understanding of risk adjustments and we will restore efficiency. I never took that idea too seriously. To me, efficient markets certainly doesn't mean the market is always wise or good. It doesn't even mean the market is always right. It just means the market's right on average. So it's pretty hard to beat it. It's, right on average doesn't sound that great, but it's a lot better than people manage to do. But you can, with very careful mathematics, eke out a small edge, a lot like at Thorpe and casinos. Casinos are still making huge amounts of money. They're still building big buildings. They're still making gigantic profits, even though Ed Thorpe figured out, no, there's a way to beat them. Markets are the same way, that for 99% of people, 99% of the time, should assume the market is efficient, should pay the lowest possible fees, should, get a diversified, low-cost, tax-efficient portfolio and forget about trying to beat it. But if you're a quant and if you live to beat things, there's lots and lots of ways to beat it.
I've seen you talk about this when people want to frame the notion of risk. They kind of put the emotional words on it. It's either negative or positive. From your quant perspective, you don't approach it that way at all, do you?
No, risk should be a neutral thing, and the example I like to give, in a sports contest, if you're ahead, you want to minimize volatility. You want to play slow. You want to, do things that will probably result in nobody scoring. If you're behind, you do wild things. You might pull the goalie in hockey. You might, do just reckless attacks in football. And it's just something you adjust up and down to achieve a goal. It's not right or wrong. It's not good or bad. It doesn't, you don't judge it by its result. You just choose what is the appropriate level for what you want to do. And here's where, John Kelly comes in. John Kelly is the guy who figured this out. And Ed Thorpe was the guy who popularized Kelly's views.
As we stay in this risk conversation, you've brought up Nassim Taleb. We've talked about the financial crisis. I can think of Don Rumsfeld and his unknown unknowns speech. Why don't you give me your perspective on black swans, right? So I think ever since his book came out with the same title, since the crisis, most large institutions, operations, at least they obviously have a knowledge of this now. Now, whether or not they're taking preparations for it or not, that's a whole different issue. How do you perceive preparation for a black swan? And do people go far enough or too far?
Nassim has given actually different definitions of a black swan. The one I like best is a black swan is a low probability, high impact event that happened because it was unexpected. If you take that attitude, go back to 9/11, we knew there were hijackers. There have been lots and lots of hijackers of airplanes, but all of the previous ones had wanted to live. And we knew there were suicide bombers, but all of them had been low-skill young men, usually men anyway, who struck close to home. Therefore, we had all the security around both of those things. We had zero security against a high-skilled, coordinated group of hijackers who didn't want to live, who were willing to die, and therefore that's why the attacks happened. And if we had, let's say we prepared against it, we thought, that might happen, and we took precautions. We locked cockpit doors. We, did all the other things we do now. The terrorists would have found some other way to create an event, Preparing for a black swan, you can change the nature of the black swan, but you're not going to avoid it. Things are still going to happen because they're unexpected, and there's just no way around that. So trying to prepare for that is counterproductive. All you do is you make yourself more predictable. You're better off not doing that. In terms of the sort of more everyday black swan, the one that happens is just always out there, just low probability, high impact, that people do know about, I think people don't give enough attention to that. One of the things Nassim said that I really agree with is people overestimate the probability of the last big event recurring, and they underestimate the probability of some new type of event occurring. Another part of his philosophy that I think people forget is, yes, he's famous for buying out of the money options, but he's also famous for buying at the money options. His general philosophy is that people expect the average amount of change, and that almost never happens. Either nothing happens or something much bigger than average happens. But people do all their planning as if, we're going to get a 1 standard deviation event. It's a very good bet. It's a big money-making event to say, look, we're either going to get something, within 0.1 standard deviation, or we're going to get something beyond 2 standard deviations. Things are just a lot more concentrated in the center and in the tails. A lot of the money you make, a lot of the actual financial advantage, a lot of the quant advantage consists of betting nothing will happen. I think regulators, I think people who don't have a lot of experience in actually managing risk, who just, sort of try and do it by gut, tend to be preparing for those one standard deviation events, the ones that don't happen.
Aaron, I can't keep you. I could probably just sit here and pick your mind across all kinds of topics, just like they do on Quora all day long. Let me direct people. All your books, Amazon, easily found. Is there a website we can send people to? Any place you want them to come check out more about you? I guess they can just go to Quora and ask questions, yeah?
They can. I also have a website, eRaider, ERAIDER.com. I'm not real diligent about keeping it up to date, but it's got some fun stuff there if people want to know me. And it's got an email address, or they can, get me through Quora or lots of other places. Bloomberg, if you look at my Bloomberg articles, they've got my email address at the bottom.
Aaron, cool stuff. I appreciate you taking some time today. And enjoy Coronado. The sunsets are the best, right? Point Loma off to the right, the best stuff, huh?
It is, although I have to say that this time of year, we don't get the greatest views. When they're, a little later in the summer, we'll get them actually over the ocean. But right now they're behind the point, but it's still beautiful.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Take care.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.